Welcome to Human Conditions, a podcast about innovative 20th century texts, which is part of the LRB's Close Reading series. I'm your host, Adam Schatz, and my guest on this episode is my friend Brent Hayes Edwards, a distinguished scholar of African American and Francophone literature at Columbia University. On our previous episode, we discussed W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. In this conversation, our second of four, we will be talking about Aimé Césaire's 1950 essay, Discourse on Colonialism, a groundbreaking text in the history of 20th century anti-colonialism and a precursor to the writings of Césaire's protégé, Frantz Fanon. Césaire was born in 1913 on a plantation where his father worked as a steward in Basse-Pointe in the north of Martinique. He grew up near Mount Pelée, the volcano that had leveled the city of Saint-Pierre a decade before his birth, and he often characterized himself as Peléen, volcanic, explosive, capricious, qualities that defined his poetry. After his studies at the Lycée Victor Schellcher in Fort-de-France, Césaire left for Paris to attend the Lycée Louis le Grand, a prestigious public school where he met a young student at the Sorbonne, Léopold Sédar Senghor, a Senegalese poet. Along with Léon Damas, a writer from French Guiana who had been a classmate of Césaire's in Martinique, Césaire and Senghor went on to found the movement that became known as négritude, a philosophy of black consciousness. In 1939, Césaire published his most famous poem, The Epic Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, which was hailed as a revolutionary work of black surrealism by André Breton and Jean-Paul Sartre, and which is still considered one of the greatest poems written in French in the 20th century. During the war, Césaire and his wife Suzanne, herself an extraordinary essayist, edited Tropique, a journal of anti-colonial critique, négritude poetry, and cultural resistance to fascism. After the war, Césaire became the mayor of Fort-de-France and a communist deputy in the French Parliament, presiding over the departmentalization of his island in 1946. After breaking with communism in 1955, he founded his own party, the Martinican Progressive Party. Césaire died in 2008 at the age of 94, the country's most famous writer as well as its most influential politician, a figure whose renown in his own country among his own people was comparable to that of W.E.B. Du Bois in Black America. So Brent, Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism is the second of the texts you've chosen for this podcast. Could you tell us why you selected it and perhaps also why you chose it over Césaire's poem, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land?
To me, they have to be read together. You have to think about the relation between his poetics and his politics, and his critique of political discourse. He is, as you summarized, one of the great poet-politicians of the former French Empire in the 20th century, and the two parts of his portfolio go together. He is a poet and a politician. He's first of all a poet, but it's important to get to the politics of his poetry.
Even the poetics of his politics.
Exactly. And his interventions as a politician, as a member of the National Assembly. And so for me, it's actually hard to extricate the two. And I tend to teach the notebook along with discourse when I teach Césaire. And I try to get my students to think about the poetic quality of his political discourse and the political interventions of his poetry.
Well, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Discourse on Colonialism, given what you've just said, I think we should probably talk about the poem that preceded it by more than a decade, since Notebook is such a milestone in his career and an important guide to his politics, as you said, to his imagination of the West Indies and modern history, the question of blackness, and the struggle for freedom.
Notebook is one of the great poetic works of the 20th century in French. And just a few ways to frame it in terms of understanding the accomplishment of this book-length poem. First of all, I'd point out that Césaire is a student. He's a graduate student. He comes as prodigious scholarship student to Paris to pursue graduate work at the École Normale in the early 1930s. And it's as a graduate student that he meets Léopold Senghor from Senegal and Léon Damas from Guyana, from French Guiana, who become the core of the negritude movement in that interwar period. But at that point, he's trying to get into the École Normale. He's studying for the exams that you have to take to get into the École Normale, the most important of the French graduate institutions. And he's trying to figure out what it means to be a writer and an intellectual. Notebook is, it's not for nothing that it's called Notebook. I think he's thinking about education. He's thinking about the impositions of a colonial mindset and trying to write himself out of a mindset of assimilation in the book. So it's an experimental book. It's a book that's trying to, as the title implies, a notebook. We don't have the finished form. We're not quite sure what it looks like. And in terms of the accomplishment, there are two broad stroke things I'd say. On the one hand, Césaire is trying to figure out not just how to write himself out of a mindset of assimilation, but how to write himself toward a Caribbean poetry. What is French Caribbean poetry? What should it look like? What should it sound like if it's not going to imitate the forms of late 19th century canonical French poetry, which, if you look at Martinican and Guadeloupean poetry in the 1920s,
Often very imitative of classical French.
exactly, it's straightforward mimesis. And Césaire says, shouldn't we have our own voice? Shouldn't we sound a little bit different? So this is a book that tries to figure out what a properly Caribbean poetics would be. And the other thing it does in paving the way for what becomes a cultural and philosophical and political movement of negritude is it attempts to tunnel into and kind of undo from within the very terms of racial identity in the French language, and specifically the term nègre, which is a hard word to translate. It's somewhere in between the N word, it was quite derogatory in French at that point, and Negro in English.
But he reclaims and redeems it in some way.
So the invention of negritude, which this poem, the first version of which is published in a journal in 1939, and then it's expanded after the war, the final version, the definitive version, is published in 1956. This poem, the Notebook, renovates that negative term. It takes this derogatory term, nègre, and makes it into a term of identity, a term of affiliation, a term of pride, so a negritude. Not unlike the way blackness is renovated in the 1960s in African American discourse.
Or the way that queer became a positive word in the gay movement.
Exactly. So it's a poem that digs into language and really thinks about the force of language and the way language shapes the way we understand our place in the world. And in the way the speaker of the notebook proceeds, it's not enough to just say, I reject the negative terms, black is beautiful, I'm proud of myself. Césaire, on the contrary, says we have to wallow in negativity. We have to get down. There's a culminating point about a third of the way through the poem where the speaker says, I find a man lying flat on the ground. I have to get down to the bottom of my self-hatred, of my internalized racism, in order to come out on the other side. And so rather than pretending I can forget about the negativity of the past of enslavement and colonization, I have to dig down into it and recognize my own complicity in it in order to think myself, to dream myself, to push myself beyond it, and to get to a place where I can take a term that still has that complicated negative baggage and make it into a positive term without forgetting the negativity, but making it into a term that we can rally around.
I think this is the reason that Sartre paid so much attention to this poem in his essay Black Orpheus, introducing the great Senghor edited anthology of black poetry, because it's the idea of, as you said, jumping and plunging into this negativity, plunging into this darkness, as it were, in order to reemerge a new person.
Exactly. Although, as Fanon, as Frantz Fanon points out, Sartre, after that extraordinary, lengthy analysis of Césaire in the preface to the Senghor anthology in 1948, then says, well, this is just a step in the dialectic, and we've got to get to universal class revolution. So the black writer has to go through this stage, but this is a stage. We have to come out on the other side to universal revolution. So there's a way that it's a certain kind of backhanded praise where he says, let's look at the wonderful accomplishment of Césaire, but then says, we're going to have to take a step beyond that.
Right, just a weak stage we have to get beyond. Now, this poem is also a kind of origin story, isn't it? I mean, it's really about the whole history of the Middle Passage and the founding of what were called the old colonies and the struggles of people on the islands.
Definitely. It's a poem not just about Caribbean poetry, but specifically Martinican poetry. It starts by evoking Césaire's childhood and poverty in oppression in Fort-de-France and in Martinique in the 19s and 20s, and tries to think about the degradation of Martinican life in particular then. And it gives, although it's called Notebook of Return to the Native Land, and he writes it in Europe, and one assumes that because it's an evocation of Martinican reality in the interwar period, that the return is to Martinique. It's also a return to African identity, to ancestry, to questions of blackness more broadly. So it's an interestingly triangulated poem where it's, yes, about being in Europe and thinking back to one's upbringing in Martinique, but it's also, and inherently these are the same thing, returning to Martinique is also returning to blackness in Martinique and returning to Africa and thinking through the history of the slave trade and thinking about oppression not just in Martinique, but comparatively across the globe, whether we're talking about Harlem, whether we're talking about Calcutta. These are geographies that the poem invokes. It has a kind of comparative, world-straddling ambition or vision to it.
Right, I mean, he writes at one point, "As there are hyena men and panther men, so I shall be a Jew man, a Kafir man, a Hindu from Calcutta man, a man from Harlem who hasn't got the vote, famine man, curse man, torture man. You may seize him at any minute, beat him, kill him. Yes, perfectly fine to kill him, accounting to no one, having to offer an excuse to no one. A Jew man, a pogrom man, a whelp, a beggar. No race holds a monopoly of beauty, intelligence, and strength. There is room for all at the rendezvous of conquest."
Yeah, at another moment, although it is a Martinican-focused poem and evokes Martinican reality of the interwar period, as I said, at another moment he calls Martinique mon île non-clôture, my non-closure island. An unusual way to frame it, but it's that comparative, open-ended, world-straddling ambition that is part of the way he defines Caribbeanness, this openness, this comparative sensibility that connects South Asia to North America, to Europe, to Africa, to the Caribbean.
Because I think probably a common perception at the time is that an island is somehow not part of global history. And he's saying, no, this is very much a part of the story of modern times, of capitalism, of modernity.
That we are at the crossroads. Yeah, we are the crossings of culture right here, and we're connected to these broad historical global forces.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Human Conditions, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.